Many of you are my heroes. I've read the work of so many of the journalists and authors that are being honored here tonight, and so it is a great privilege for me to be a part of this celebration. 30 days ago, I walked out of a Birmingham jail with an innocent man who'd spent the last 30 years on Alabama's death row for a crime he did not commit. He was locked in solitary confinement in a 5-by-7 cell for 30 years, where every day the state of Alabama tried to execute him. He witnessed 53 executions during his time on death row, and yet this man persisted and he fought. We got involved in his case and came up with really dramatic evidence of his innocence. They had made a claim that a gun found in his mother's home had been matched to these crime bullets, and it was very clear that this was a false claim. And for the next 15 years, we argued and argued and argued and could not get anyone to pay attention until finally we got the Supreme Court of the United States to overturn the case, and that's what led to a new trial and ultimate retesting, and then he was released. And when we walked out of that jail, I was trying to make myself feel triumphant and excited and celebratory, but I actually felt sad and tragic and overwhelmed because I kept thinking, well, this surely is enough for us to do something different. How can we, in a great country like ours, threaten to kill someone who is innocent for 30 years, do what we have done to this man, and not change? And yet I knew that things would not change. And why I'm particularly honored to be in this company tonight is because journalists, writers, authors, media personnel are about narrative changing, complicating the pictures that we see. We've never really talked about our history of racial inequality in America. We haven't talked about what slavery has done to us. I think we're still shadowed and compromised and burdened with the legacy that was created by slavery. We have inherited it. And because we haven't dealt with the narrative, I don't think we're going to make the progress. And we've got to change the narrative. I don't believe the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude. I don't think the great evil of American slavery was forced labor. I believe the great evil of American slavery was the narrative of racial difference we created to legitimate it, the ideology of white supremacy. And the 13th Amendment didn't do anything about that narrative. And because of that, I don't believe slavery ended in 1865. I believe it evolved. We had decades of terrorism between the end of Reconstruction and World War II. People of color didn't come to New York and Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland and Los Angeles and Oakland as immigrants looking for new opportunities. They came as refugees from terror. Until you address the trauma and the challenges that that exile created, you will not see the success in those communities that you'll see in other communities. And we've never talked about that. And part of what we're seeing in so many of our communities is the way these narratives have never been confronted. Older people come up to me, they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get so upset when I hear someone on TV talking about how we're dealing with terrorism in our country for the first time after 9/11. They say, we grew up with terrorism. We were bombed and threatened and lynched our whole lives, and that narrative hasn't changed. I hear people talking about civil rights in this country, and it sounds like a carnival, a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we just changed all these laws. And if that was our history, we'd be a great place. But that's not our history. Our history is that for decades, we humiliated people of color. For decades, we injured and marginalized and brutalized and belittled and compromised the lives and aspirations of people of color. And now we are dealing with the 4th manifestation of our silence, which is mass incarceration. We ended the civil rights era by beginning the era of mass incarceration. We went from a prison population of 300,000 in 1972 to 2.3 million today. We've got the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and we're not ashamed of it, even though we're doing dreadful things to these communities. I was in Baltimore on Friday, and the great challenge we face in this country right now is we have a generation of young people who are born into violent families, they live in violent neighborhoods, they go to violent schools, they are traumatized by violence by the time they're 5, and these kids don't believe they're going to be free or alive by the time they're 21. And we make that a credible and legitimate thing to believe. And so we're worried about CVS stores, but we're not worried about the hope and aspirations of all of these millions of children living in the margins of our society. And so I think we've got to change the narrative. The great mass incarceration has been sustained by the politics of fear and anger. And if we don't expose that fear and expose that anger, we'll be vulnerable to all the excess that we've seen fear and anger create across the world. I'm persuaded that injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And fear and anger are the essential ingredients to injustice and hopelessness and mass incarceration and excessive punishment. And so we've got work to do, but we've got work to do at a time when I'm really energized by the exciting work that so many people are doing. The Bureau of Justice reports that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison. 1 in 3. That wasn't true in the 20th century. That wasn't true in the 19th century. It became true in the 21st century. And so the work does continue. I'm really honored to get an award in the name of George Barrett. Because George Barrett was one of those people who understood that if you want to create justice, if you really want to create change, sometimes you've got to be the person who stands when everybody else is sitting. You've got to be the person who speaks when everybody else is quiet. And it's important, I think, that we recognize the rule of law, because a democracy can create terrific oppression and inequality. There's nothing about majority voting that insulates poor people or disfavored people or black people or undocumented people or gay people from all kinds of oppression. If we don't talk about rights and enforce those rights in our courts, led by people like George Barrett, we will not get to justice. And so I'm really honored that you would create space in this incredibly impressive array of awards to honor advocates and people who do what I do. I am hopeful that we can create real change. We've got a project at EJI. We want to begin to change the landscape of the South. You go to the Deep South, and we love talking about mid-19th century history in Alabama and Mississippi. We just don't like to talk about slavery. We've got 59 monuments and markers in Alabama to the Confederacy and not a word about slavery. And we want to change that. And so we're putting up markers and monuments to mark the spaces where the slave trade was most active. I want to put a marker and monument at every lynching space in this country, because that's the way you change narratives. You can't go to Germany today without being forced to confront the history of the Holocaust. And I think that's a good thing. You go to Berlin, there are markers and monuments and stones everywhere. They want you to go to the concentration camps and reflect soberly on the history of the Holocaust. In this country, we do the opposite. You say the word race and people start running for exits. They get uncomfortable, and we've got to change that narrative. And I think the law has a critical role to play. And by honoring lawyers and those who are trying to do social justice work, you make us feel affirmed. I'll end with this. I think there's a different metric system for those of us who really believe in social justice. And whether you're a journalist or a writer or an author, whatever, that metric system is what we have to remember. We can't change the world with just the ideas in our mind. We've got to be smart. We've got to do good investigation. We've got to be very informed and tactical and strategic. But I believe we change the world when we allow the ideas in our mind to be fueled by some conviction in our heart. And we've got to use a different metric system. We can't worry about how many readers or how many people or how much money. There's another metric system that I've inherited and learned from the people I've been around. I'll end with this. I was giving a talk in a church not too long ago, and there was an older man sitting in the back of the church while I was giving this talk, and he was staring at me real hard the whole time I was talking. And he looked at me very angrily, I thought. He just had a very stern expression. And I got through my talk, although I was very distracted by this man. He was in this wheelchair. And people came up to me when I finished the talk. They were very nice and polite, but this man kept sitting in the back staring. And he got a little boy to wheel him up to me. And he wheeled him down the middle of this church aisle. And the man came up to me with this very stern look on his face. And he got in front of me, and he put his hand up, and he said to me, he said, "Do you know what you're doing? I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And then this man looked at me, and he says, "You're beating the drum for justice." And then he says, "You keep beating the drum for justice." And then he said, "Come here, come here, come here." And he grabbed me by my jacket. He pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, "Let me show you something." And this older man looked up at me, and he turned his head. He said, "You see this scar I have behind my right ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama in 1963 trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. "You see this cut I have down here at the bottom of my neck?" He says, "I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi during Freedom Summer." He turned his head. He said, "Do you see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965. He said, "Let me tell you something, young man." He says, "People look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But let me tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And tonight I will tell you, working in Alabama, standing up with condemned prisoners, facing a system that seems so concerned about fairness. We've got a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. When you deal with that day in and day in, you get some cuts and you get some bruises and you get some scars. And I don't mind telling you I'm a cut and bruised and scarred lawyer, but tonight I'm also an honored lawyer by being in your company, being in this space, and being part of this wonderful, wonderful celebration. Thank you so very, very much.